Good evening, visitors. Welcome to the Australian War Memorial's Last Post ceremony. My name is Richard Cruz, and joining us today from the Australian Army is Major Graham Hales. We're honoured to acknowledge this evening Colonel Matthew Weston, Deputy Chief of Army, New Zealand, Major General Justin Elwood, Deputy Chief of Army, Australia, and the accompanying delegation. We're also honoured to welcome members of the Indonesian Army Command and Staff College, Indonesia. As always, we welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that love and support them. We acknowledge the members of RSL and Services Clubs Association, RSL Victoria and RSL Queensland, who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony across Australia. During this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the Pool of Reflection by visitors and students on behalf of the following schools. From New South Wales, Tea Gardens Public School. From Queensland, Calvary Christian College, Carbrook. And from Western Australia, Serpentine Jarradale Grammar School, Munjajong. Could I ask you to please stand and join in singing the National Anthem. Those that are able, please be seated. I now invite the Director of the Australian War Memorial, Dr. Brendan Nelson, to the lectern.
Today marks the 103rd anniversary of one of the most heroic yet tragic battles fought by Australia's army in our nation's history. At Gallipoli in August 1915, a series of coordinated attacks were planned and executed to break the stalemate. The Battle of Lone Pine would commence at 4:30 in the afternoon of the 6th of August. And then in the early hours, the New Zealanders would begin their assault on Chanock Bear, its country's finest yet most tragic moment at Gallipoli. And at 4:30 in the morning of the 7th of August, the dismounted light horse of the 3rd Light Horse Brigade would attack the Turkish trenches in the northern part of the Anzac sector. 4 waves of dismounted light horse, the 8th Light Horse of Victoria in the 1st and 2nd waves, and the 10th Light Horse, the Western Australians, in the 3rd and 4th waves. The Turkish trenches were only 20 to 60 metres away. The commanding officer of the 8th Light Horse was a man called Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Henry White, a 33-year-old maltster, a beer maker from Ballarat. He loved the men of the 8th Light Horse and he volunteered to lead them in the attack. The Age newspaper correspondent Philip Schuler was present to observe and record what would happen. The artillery bombardment of the Turkish lines had finished early, and most of it had gone over it. Schuler recorded White shaking hands with his fellow officers. He stood down in the trench and, standing on the fire step, in eerie silence as the Turks tested machine guns and rifles. His watch in hand, he said, "Men, you have 10 minutes to live, and I will lead you." When the whistle blew, they all went over, and Schuler recorded White advancing only 10 paces before he fell. Of the 300 officers and men in the first 2 waves who advanced into withering machine gun fire, 153 were killed with White, another 83 were wounded. Having tried unsuccessfully to stop the attack, the 10th Light Horse filed into the trench over the dead, the dying and the wounded. Trooper Harold Rush, aged 23, famously embraced the man next to him and said, "Goodbye, God bless you, Cobber." And that would be the epitaph for his headstone. He held hands with the man next to him and said a prayer. The men removed their wedding rings, photographs of wives and families and children, wrote last notes, pinned them to the inside of the trench, and again they all went over. And as was depicted in Peter Weir's 1981 Gallipoli film, Gresley and Wilfred Harper from Western Australia ran like schoolboys in a foot race toward their death. Of the 600 Australians who went over in the attack at the Neck, 372 casualties. And Sergeant Clifson Pinnock, who miraculously survived the first wave, 5 days later wrote to his mother and said, "Roll call was the saddest. 47 of 550 answered the call. I cried like a baby." Early in 1919, when Charles Bean, the founder of this place, went back to Gallipoli, he described this area of the Neck as resembling scattered thin white snow. So thickly clustered, he said, were the bones, it wasn't possible to pass without treading upon them. Alexander Henry White had 2 things of immense importance to him around his skeletal remains. One was a gold locket on a chain within which was a photograph of his wife Myrtle and his infant son, whom he called Young Bill, who would be cared for later by legacy and train as a doctor and serve in the Second World War. The other was a Bible, and within the Bible was a newspaper cutting, and it was a poem. "Let me be a little braver when temptation bids me waver. Let me be a little meeker with the brother that is weaker. Let me think more of my neighbour and a little less of me." And therein is the lesson for us 103 years later.
Thank you, Dr. Nelson. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through to the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight we'll read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 102,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and operations over more than a century. But first, we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths and floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the pool of reflection.
Today, we remember and pay tribute to Lance Corporal George Thomas Hughes. George Hughes was born around 1876 to Mr. and Mrs. David Hughes of Borough, New South Wales. Very little is known of his early life. As a young adult, he was living in Singleton and was a prominent and active member of the Singleton Young Men's Club, an adjunct to the Women's Christian Temperance Union. He was a very active member of the local church and Sunday school. In 1905, he was accepted for service with the Presbyterian Church and was sent to Balranald to establish a ministry in the parish there. It was reported that he was most faithful and diligent in carrying out the duties of his office. George Hughes resigned his position in Balranald to enlist in the Australian Imperial Force shortly after the outbreak of war in 1914. He sold a considerable amount of property at the time. Hughes was known as a true sportsman and was particularly attached to his horses and his dog, probably the reason that saw him accepted for service with the 8th Light Horse Regiment. He proved to be an able soldier and shortly after arriving in Egypt was promoted to Lance Corporal. The Light Horse were considered unsuitable for initial operations at Gallipoli, but by early May proved too valuable a source of manpower, and the men were landed without their horses. The regiment spent weeks holding various parts of the front line. In June, Hughes wrote, "Our position here is only 15 yards from the entrenched Turks, and we can hear them singing their chants every night at their religious service. We have had a taste of the real thing, and we find it serious business. Everything is in the Turks' favour as far as the situation goes. All one needs to do to escape the fatigue is to show his head 3 inches over the earthworks, and he will be permanently relieved from duty." He added, "The boys from Australia are soldiers of no mean order and stand the strain as cool and fearless as many others we have met. In fact, they show any indifference that no one would believe who had not witnessed it." In early August 1915, as part of a wider offensive, the 8th Light Horse Brigade formed the first 2 waves of an attack on Turkish positions at the neck. Met by fierce Turkish machine gun fire, each wave of the assault failed with extremely heavy casualties. Lance Corporal George Thomas Hughes was missing after the operation. One of his mates later told the story of what happened to him. He wrote, "In that charge on the 7th of August, I followed him out of the trench, and after firing several shots, I was hit in the foot. I noticed Hughes was still firing. Then as I slid down the bank, I saw him drop his rifle and roll over on his back without any further movement. I think Hughes was the last man in my troops to be shot. Of those who went into the charge, only 2 are left of that troop." Hughes's body was never identified after the battle, and today is commemorated on the Lone Pine Memorial to the missing. He was 39 years old. His name is listed on the Roll of Honour on my right, among almost 62,000 Australians who died while serving in the First World War. His photograph is displayed beside the pool of reflection. This is but one of the many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Lance Corporal George Thomas Hughes, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
Please stand for the reading of the ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
Lest we forget.
Lest we forget. We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Pozières or in the low scrub at Gallipoli, with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, that concludes this evening's last post ceremony. We thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial and wish you all a very good evening. Thank you.